Asteroid of fear.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Men of the House podcast. And on today's episode, we have Scotty Aemis, and we're going to talk about childhood trauma, but specifically to how that leads and bleeds into our adult lives and you know, how it impacts us and what we can do to kind of fight back against that and get our feet back underneath us and our head in the right space and kind of tackle some of these issues because I don't think we always see them um, until we're further down the road. But how are you doing today, Scotty?
Doing very well. Thank you very much. A little warm these days and throughout the country, but I appreciate being invited and appreciate getting a chance to talk to your audience. So it's doing great. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's start off a little bit about kind of your background, how you kind of got into the space, and maybe talk about growing up a little bit, because that way we can see how you got into childhood trauma, if you have any, how it impacted you. Because have most times, we pursue this out of trying to find answers for ourselves.
Well, I can assure you one thing, I did not intend to get into childhood trauma. It was never a goal and it was never a thought process. So I'm come from outside of the Philadelphia area, pretty standard growing up, family, in public school, going to the normal playing sports and getting involved in church and organizations and going to college down in Florida, and just it never even dawned on me that we would be getting into this stuff. So a very standard process, and probably one that leads to thinking, not challenging thought process of what life is about. You just kind of go with what the society tells you, and you just go along thinking that those are the rules, and you never really question your subconscious or whatever. You just think whatever you live by are the rules, and that's that. And that was kind of the shocking part that when I eventually got into this process. And I guess what the lead up was when we decided to adopt our kids from a baby house in Russia. And we basically went over there. It was, kind of a difficult environment. Kids came back, we were not really ever prepared for anything other than, oh, we're here to love them and they'll be appreciated and we'll all live happily ever after, and they'll have the exact same lifestyle and life that I grew up with. And there's no, that's a simple thing in the world. Well, we learned life doesn't work that way.
Right.
Life isn't all fastballs down the middle. There's a lot of curveballs and sliders and spitballs and things like that. So,
Well, and you can't always just change the environment. I mean, environment is important, and we know, especially like people who quit using drugs or alcohol, like change your environment. We
yeah,
know that that's kind of an important factor, and it does help, but it's kind of one of those things of there's that saying like you can change your environment or your place, but if you don't change who you are along with it, nothing changes. And somebody with trauma, especially children from, let's say,
different country, or even,
yes,
or it could be from an orphanage, or it doesn't. It could be, eventually we learned that kids can have trauma from not having enough food in the house, can not have it from a difficult family situation. There's a lot of situations that they can create it. And the interesting thing, well, one of the lines I often mention that you kind of brought up about change, is that change is certain, but growth is optional, right?
oh, I
So
love that.
it's how we address it and how we deal with it. And that's really the keys to these things, because no matter who we are in life, we're going to get a curveball. And are we ready for it? Are we ready to adapt and change and grow from it? And how do we do that? And that's really my life story in the last 15 years. And that's what I want to share and encourage others, that no matter what it is, we can adjust and change and as they say, adjust the sails, right, on our boats. So one of the things we learned, at least in our world of adoption, fostering, is that there is no prescription. They don't tell you ahead of time, oh, this is going to be the problem. This is going to be an issue. And so you just assume that whatever you grew up with or whatever you see in your world is what it's going to happen. And when it doesn't find that way, when all of a sudden children, in this case, the trauma came from kind of not as much physical abuse, but neglect, abandonment, that we weren't prepared for that. We didn't know what to do. We
Is it
just
kind of
went
a
back.
lack as well?
Yeah,
And sometimes, when I think of lack, like when you mentioned, a lack of food in the house, but that can also apply to a lack of love, a lack of bonding, because we
yeah.
know that there's that 18 months that determines your attachment style when you're a kid. And if you don't get that bonding with your parents or your caretaker or loved one, then that
It's
goes a long way.
it's shocking. And I oftentimes say bad doesn't go away with time. When
Oh,
something happens, you're going to have to address it, and sooner or later, you're going to address it one way or the other. And if kids don't have an experience or have a bad experience, what are you going to do as parents? Because they're not capable to know how to change and how to do things differently.
what
One
were
of the
what, well, what were some of the first signs that you noticed? Like you bring back a child, you adopt a child, and what are some of the first things that made you even ask the question?
and a lot of it, a lot of things were like you show some love, but their response doesn't come back to you with love, or there's all of a sudden with peers there's little fights or pushes or trips, tripping one another, and this doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? Then you want to address them and tell them they're wrong, and they're not really looking at you or paying attention to you. There's just something missing in that link and that connection, as you said, is in terms of that attachment. And so at first you don't really think about it. You think you revert to what you had as a child, which was you just follow orders, and therefore you have this need or desire to show the authority figure. Then all of a sudden, over time, you realize, well, being the authority, or what I call authoritarianism, because it's a power position, doesn't work with kids with trauma, because all of a sudden they look at the world in terms of, oh, all my caregivers, I can't trust them because they hurt me. So why am I going to listen to you? Why am I, authority is given, right? Authoritarianism is power, which is imposed. And one doesn't know this unless one goes through the process. And so that those were a lot of little issues. And then by the time they went to school, I mean, my 5-year-old, I don't know if it was a record or not, but he got thrown off the bus because of his behaviors. And then all day long at school, there were issues, and so there's just one thing after another. And the question is also that as a parent, you don't question yourself. So therefore, oh, there must be something wrong with my child. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, that's the thought process it goes to. I got to fix them. I don't have to fix myself. Aha. And it doesn't get any better, because the more you want to fix somebody else, the less they get fixed.
Yeah.
It's a natural process, no matter what it is, whether it's childhood trauma or people who in drug. Nobody wants to be judged, and nobody wants to be told what to do, and nobody wants to be fixed. They want an environment where they can grow and fix fix themselves. So this eventually manifested itself into a point where we were actually almost having our kids taken away from us. I mean, we had child services, as they call it, in most states, visiting us constantly, because we had lots of counselors, and kids from another country don't really have the language and don't have so there's also OT and speech and behavior and all kinds of counselors that are coming in. Everyone is a mandated reporter, so everyone is going to report something when a child is acting up. And it's a strange thing when the child services group of your state know you by your first name and start
Yeah.
calling you up saying, "Hey, Scott, we got you another one." so it's so it just kept going and going. And at that moment, when the judge turned to me and basically said, is this going to be how you're going to live your life? Is this your legacy that your children are going to be taken away from you? That's kind of when it kind of hit me right in the face, saying, wow, everything has to change. I have to take a new look at this. And I don't know what it is. I don't know how to do it, but I know something has to be different. And as fate would have it, God would have it. I'm not sure who people are religious or not. I just happened to run into somebody who had gone through a similar process. They had adopted kids. They were a counselor for kids, and they explained, "Hey, this is all about childhood trauma." I said, "Childhood trauma? What's that?" No, really, I had no idea. I thought it was just a matter of kids not learning and paying attention and obeying. And once I got into it, once I learned about it, once I found a scientist who really can lay it all out in terms of that childhood trauma in this case is an actual brain injury, no different than if you broke your arm. It's an
Right.
actual injury that you need healing. So your brain has changed to be in a constant fight or flight mode, right? And so when an impulse comes in, instead of thinking about it, instead of giving it some strategic thought, what's right or wrong, it goes right to the brainstem, which is all going to be fight or flight, all emotion. How do I protect myself? And that's what, and a child is in that constantly. And then, so how do you change that? How do you get it out of that mode? And that's what my last 10 years has all been about, learning that process, applying it, and understanding how do you change the neural waves from the working out of the brainstem to working out of the high brain or the prefrontal cortex again. And what we learned, and what our neuroscientist person that we follow, a guy named Bruce Perry, wrote a book with Oprah just a few years ago, all about trauma. It's all said that it's all about relationships. That all growth, all healing comes through development of positive relationships. And then all of a sudden said, aha. So it's not about authority. It's not about yelling. It's not about consequences. It's not about telling them, punishing them. It's all about developing the connections and relationships. And once they feel safe, once they feel loved, all of a sudden they can open up and accept. They can build resilience. All of a sudden, the brain, the neural pathways can adjust from just being to the lower brain or the brainstem back to the prefrontal cortex. All of a sudden, they're able to handle these instances and begin to grow slowly over time and heal. And that's unfortunately that might take years, might take decades, but it heals. They can heal. They can be on a healing process, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for progress, not perfection, and we're looking for a way of moving forward and letting our kids heal. And it's whether it's childhood trauma, and there's lots of people out there with adult trauma. It's the same process, and that's what we as parents and we as caregivers need to do as much as possible.
How did you deal with, kind of want to take a step back, and when you were told, those words, is that the legacy you want to leave, having your children
Yeah.
taken away from you? That those are pretty powerful words. And I can just imagine, being a father myself, and when my child doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to obey, is hard-headed, all these things, and you're just like, I want to help. So I could imagine the feeling of helplessness that you get when you adopt a child. You're trying to provide this loving, caring thing to someone that may otherwise never stand a chance of receiving that kind of love, and to only be met with what I can imagine feels like defeat. Um, how did you deal with that, and how long was it in between kind of the judge telling you that and that person that you ran into saying, "Hey, it's childhood trauma"? What was that period in between, and how long was it? Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, how did you deal with those emotions
Well, as you can imagine, it was extremely emotional, and it feels like the low of lows. I mean, I'm sure in for many other people in different instances, they can feel like that. And you pointed out the right word. It was a sense of hopelessness. Like, I don't know what to do differently. I've never, I mean, I didn't know where to draw resources. I didn't know what to do. And literally I ran into that person that same week.
Oh, wow.
It was just, it was almost like fate that it happened so quickly. And it could be that I was drawn to looking for answers anywhere possible, and that person just happened to have an answer that made sense. It connected with what was going on so well because they had gone through it and they had processed it, and they had an answer, and they sent us into a direction. I mean, I still had to do the research. I still had to read many books, and I still had to do lots of interviewing, discussions, topics, things like that, and understanding, well, is it just a matter of knowing it, or how do you actually apply it? I mean, that's really in this case, it's the hardest part, because one of the things I learned over this process is it's all about we call it re-traumatization, meaning, great, I can do all the great things in the world, but if the child is then stuck in a position where they revert, the same thing happens, the same issues happen, they're not going to improve at all. I mean, one of the points I lay out in a book that I've written in our discussions is a line that says, it's not how many great things you do, it's how many negative things you can eliminate. So we're trying to create this environment of safety, similar to, I mean, if you can imagine a cast over your arm, you broke your arm, are you going to go out and throw a ball the next day? No, you have a cast on because it needs time to heal. Well, how do you heal? What do you do? What's that time frame? Because obviously it's not 6 weeks. It's going to be 6 years or 16 years and whatnot. And how do you create an environment of safety? And these are all the things I needed to learn and study and accept that I'm not going to be able to fix my child, but I can create an environment where they can grow and heal. And through that process, they'll fix themselves. The brain will fix itself. It'll, for all the difficulties and protection that the neurons that it changed to protect itself through going to the brainstem, it'll change it back. And so my job eventually, as I learned, was to create an environment where that safety was the number one process. They feel safe, over time, then their neural pathways can adjust backwards as well. So that was it. There's a lot of things into it. There's a lot of principles that I've learned. Again, I mentioned before, authority versus authoritarianism. One of the lines we use is that, for example, the value of your love is not dependent on your child's response. We have this tendency to think as parents that if I do something good, if I create an environment, if I create something positive, well, I expect something positive back to me. But that's not the way it works in trauma. That positive response might be 10 years from now. So how can you keep going? How can you keep doing it and not get that immediate response? Well, that's a learned behavior over time. That's a change that's a personal change. How do we change to accept that this is a different process? It's not easy.
What were some of the first steps that you guys started? Like, so you ran into the person, you started doing some research, but
Sure.
what techniques and whatnot did you start deploying immediately, and kind of what did the healing journey look like? How did that take shape?
Sure. So a couple of things we learned first is starting at the base level. Everything was, what do we need to do to create this safety environment for them? And where are all the areas that they're getting constantly, I'll use the word again, re-traumatized? And so in our case, it was almost in every extracurricular activity, in addition to things that I'll get into in a second with the family. So instead of going to school, we started doing homeschool. And we found a specific church, for example, that the pastor had their own adopted kids. And so there was an environment there where people understood what was how to deal with kids that had it processed. They understood the challenges, the issues, and there were more people that were more trained in that environment. It just happened to be. So we changed churches. We reduced the number of events that we went to because everyone was a stimulating process, and the more they get stimulated, the more that they get that their behaviors get triggered. So we had to dial it down. We reduced the amount of things, quote quote, in the house. Less games, less TV, less videos, and even though it was a little bit more boring, it was safe. And kids can find lots of different things to play with. They don't have to have the latest gadgets and the latest movies and the latest video games and things like that. They'll be just fine. And all these things that allowed just a constant safe process. In addition, we had a number of, as many parents do in our situation, a number of therapists. Well, one therapist would tell you to do X, another therapist would tell you to do Y, and another therapist would tell you to do Z. And so at the end of the day, we're going all three directions and not going anywhere, right? We're stuck with no changes. And so we began to change. Okay, everybody we talk to, everybody who comes in to work with us has to have an understanding of what trauma is and can implement their services through a trauma scope. You know, that old saying, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Mhm.
Well, it's almost like if you decide that it's going to be trauma, everything has to look through building relationships first, safety first, create that environment. And so those are a lot of the things we did up front. We had to be very careful in terms of family events. Kids with trauma will look to create chaos, and because at a lot of events, and they'll, like all kids do, but specifically kids with trauma will triangulate and look to people who are giving them more attention or more gifts or more food, things like that, and that'll create a dissension within the organization. So we just stopped going to a lot of the events. More difficult for the family, but it's safer for them. So we were able to prioritize everything we did based on safety, based on how do we eliminate the triggers, and that's the process we went. Eventually, I mean, I wear this sweater over here because we found a trauma school, and so all of a sudden we found a school that the kids could go to that was specifically focused on kids with trauma. Amazing. They learn the same subjects, they learn the same projects, but they do it differently. Only 8 kids in a room. Every day they're addressed with a hello, with a touch on the shoulder, with a warm area. No homework coming out of the school. They have what's called a resolve room, where if they're acting up, they can go to and deal with it. They don't get punished. They don't get suspended. They don't get all those kind of things. And over time, all these things in conjunction lead to a greater safety, greater opportunities for them to heal with time.
Wow, you don't find that I find it interesting. It like the thought of having the trauma school, and I guess my curiosity is like, you put prisoners in a prison all together.
Sure.
When you put a bunch of kids with trauma together, does it facilitate quicker or more meaningful, better healing, or does it take away from it since or is it kind of that, hey, we understand each other, so they help each other kind of get along, but I could imagine there's some conflict at sometimes.
All the above. So, and some of your audience may have heard of what we call the 3 R's in trauma, which is regulation, relationship, and reason. So our natural tendency when someone misbehaves or does something wrong is to try to logically tell them what they did right or wrong, right?
Hmm.
But when a child has done something, it's because they're dysregulated. And it could have been because of another child. It could have been from an event. It could have been, a certain subject that came up that just triggered something. But instead of trying to tell them what's wrong or address their behavior, the first rule in a trauma school is to get them regulated. And they have a special room for that, to just calm them down and get them under control. And then the second step is always build relationship. And if you're developing a relationship, the child then begins to build trust. If they can build trust and they're calm They can over time learn to deal with these issues, become more resilient. And then lastly, you can work on the reason. What did you do right? What did you do wrong? What could you have done better? What's different? So the answer to your question, yes, very often a room full of traumatized kids will set each other off, but the whole process works, and because each kid is treated separately, individually, and with the same process in mind. We're going to keep everybody regulated. If you're dysregulated, we'll go to an area you can calm down, work with it, and go back in the classroom. We're going to develop relationships. No matter where you go, you're going to get to know your teacher. They're going to know you well. You're going to trust them. You're going to believe in them. And then over time, you can learn to deal with them with reason. And the process in this particular school, I mean, they have 4 schools, and they in the last year or so, I've joined the board of directors with them. It works. I see these kids year after year who graduate, who came in, and they give their stories about come from a broken home, come from no hope, and over time they just realized, hey, the light goes on, and all of a sudden when the light bulb switches on, it's like, huh, I have my whole life. I can make these decisions. I can do these things. This is okay. I can thrive here, and they do. And one of the advantages of the trauma schools is also, if you're ready, you can transition back into the public schools and see where you are in level resilience. That's what my kids did. They're both in public school now, heading to 12th grade, and their resilience level has increased. I don't know how to mark it, but 10 times from what it was. They can deal with kids and how kids are with their sly remarks and their slang and their
Oh yeah.
the whole bit, and where it would have set them off a few years ago. Now, it's just, oh, don't worry about him. That's just those guys. And it's like amazing. It's like, wow, these kids have grown so much. They've done so well. And
Man, that's wild. When was that started, the Lakeside,
for my kids, or for the school in general,
in general?
this particular school called Lakeside, and they serve they have 4 schools, as I mentioned, one just for girls, and then 3 others located in the Philadelphia suburbs. And in addition, it was started about 30 years ago. And they've added a couple components, which are more video training and training professionals around the country and actually around the world now. We use, I think I mentioned before, we specifically use a neuroscientist program called Bruce Perry. And his whole point is, again, that all healing comes through relationships. And then he has the brain-based therapies to prove it. And it gets applied, and we see it work year after year after year. Having said that, school is one element of these kids' life.
Right.
I mean, they can still go back to chaos, but slowly, sometimes that chaos can be reduced, and sometimes there's still challenges because they're going back into sometimes some really tough households, and it's sad, but at least they know there's a pathway, that if they choose to take ownership of their life at some point, whether as they get older in high school, they can make those changes, and they can make some terminations in life. So so far it's working. It works well, and I'm very proud to be associated with them and involved. But yes, everything is around what I call the positive, safe relationships, and how to develop them as well as possible.
Well, you said something interesting in that a kid could be at school and that can be the safe environment and whatnot, and then they could go home to a unsafe, non-connectivity type environment.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me to this point of how important it is for the caregiver, the caretaker, the parent, the guardian to be part of the process with the student, the child in the healing, because to me it seems no good if they go to the school all day in a place that's designed for that and then they go home to chaos. And how does the child get into the school? They're aware that they need the school. The parent is aware the child needs this environment, yet they're not contributing. How does that work? How do you deal with
Yeah,
that?
it's a big challenge. So, and you're right, that's always the biggest challenge. Most often, what happens is the public schools provide work with, for example, this trauma school,
Mm-hmm.
because the child can't operate successfully at that school, and it's making it difficult for the kids. So oftentimes the parents aren't even involved, but the public school is telling them, you're going to have to do something because we can't handle them. And so the kid, so then they're offered to this as an option for this trauma school. The parents are then involved in the best way possible to give them some information, some training, some ideas. It's up to them whether they're going to follow it and do it. The kids that don't make it, the kids that fail, it's usually not because of the child. It's usually because of the family environment or the difficult situation they're in, and there's too much negativity that keeps the child from feeling safe and growing. That's always an issue. One of the statistics that we use in trauma, this is a tough one, but it's important to know it is that it's estimated that 90% of our prison population either had undiagnosed or unprocessed trauma, which means one of the reasons that they're having so many issues and so many problems is because they had a really difficult time. The brain is in that fight or flight mode, and they just react or overreact, and they get and they're not in a situation where they have that way to reach out, the way to change, the way to heal. And that we're, instead of healing our kids when they're young and solving this, we're penalizing them and put them in jail when they're older.
Mm.
It's a real challenge, and you can either deal with these kids when they're children, or you're going to deal with them when they're adults. And we already have too many prisoners and too much of a prison population. And that's they call it upstream thinking, right? Let's deal with it when it happened, not when the problem occurs 20 years later. So I don't know if that answered all your questions, but
Yeah.
yes,
I was
we try
thinking,
to train the parents and get them involved in the process and see the growth.
mhm.
Many do.
Hey, after you finish listening to this amazing podcast, be sure to give it a 5-star rating. Then go check out the other podcasts in the Podcast Connection Network, including my own, Magic and Metamorphosis. Check us all out. The link will be in the episode's description.
And because most parents want the best for their children. It
Right.
just, yeah.
Or
So
they want the phone calls, the behavior to stop, at least at a
yes,
minimum,
well
they
said.
probably get tired of going to the school, but I've heard this interesting thing that I've mentioned before, and I just kind of want your thoughts on, sometimes they say, regardless of the upbringing, even if you have a good upbringing, sometimes you still end up with an adult as with some sort of trauma, or let's say still messed up per se, that you still have some sort of problems even if you had a good childhood. Some people still go off the wagon, and you had stated that you had a pretty good childhood, and when you went on this endeavor of adopting a child and fostering, you learned about all this and started doing that. But in your process, did you find any trauma of your own? And
Yeah.
even if you had a good childhood, because I mean it could come in the form of embarrassment. You don't necessarily have to be jumped and beat up or something. But something is, public embarrassment could cause it.
Um, I have to admit just from a position of not knowing what to do,
Mm-hmm.
one's natural reaction is, oh, I don't want to deal with this problem. Maybe I can just send the kids away, or not deal with it. And then you begin to seek people who will reinforce that feeling, because that's what you want to hear. You want to hear that it's not your fault, it's not your responsibility. You can just let it go and go back to your nice normal life, and watch football on Sundays, or something like that.
Right.
And and that's an impulse. And the question is, well, which impulse are you going to feed? The one that is really about what's easiest for you, what's calming for you, or this calling that you may have, and to is it a bigger difference? Is it more of a legacy? Is it more? And then your decision then becomes, which way do I go? It's they call it the hero's journey, right? Am I going to seek the positive influence or the negative influence, and what makes me feel better? What soothes my ego? What soothes my personal needs right now? And in all honesty, that's a challenge I'm sure every one of us deals with, and we certainly did. And it's like, it'd sure be a lot easier if I didn't have to deal with this.
Oh yeah.
And that was the biggest challenge. Like, do I really want to do this? Here we go again. Is it going to happen again? Will this ever stop? And for us, faith had a lot to do with it, but connecting, making a conscious, intentional decision of who we're connected with and who we're dealing with and what influences, that was important too, because the more people who were encouraging us on the journey, this journey of learning and changing and growing, and the more likelihood we were to engage in it, and especially in the early process. It could have gone either way. I mean, very easily could have gone either way.
Where do you find that? Where does that hope, that kind of steadfast, stay still, come from, in terms of you're doing this thing and you take on this responsibility and it's just way more than you ever could have anticipated, and now you're like, man, I've really got myself into something, and these aren't jeans, you can't just return them. It's not a meal you can send back. Kind of what's been the cornerstone of getting you through that, and that acceptance, and saying, okay, I've done this. This is with another human being. And even though it's not going great, I'm going to put forth my best effort, not just for them, but also for you and your spouse, how it impacts your life.
Sure.
So kind of what's been the cornerstone of getting through that and dealing with that for you, your spouse personally? Because I'm sure, that's got to be a very challenging situation to accept and deal with. And it's kind of speaking to maybe other parents who might, they want to have children, maybe they can't, or maybe they just choose to adopt. And then something like this happens and they're like, oh my gosh, what did I do? So kind of a little shout out to, what, how do you deal with that and get through it? And
Sure. And different people do it different ways. For us personally, I mean, I think there was a combination of, there was a sense of right or wrong that was passed down. But
which is kind
for
of a
us,
faith moral type of thing.
yeah, and and what is a parent's responsibility, and our world, God doesn't promise you perfect children, and God doesn't promise you a perfect life, or life itself doesn't promise you, for those people who aren't particularly faithful. But I think it's also community. We talk about all growth and all healing comes through from relationships for your kids. The same thing goes for us as adults as well. There's been a number of studies that show, that have tracked people, for example, for their prestigious colleges versus how well they did in life and world. And the numbers show that the people that have a strong set of friends, colleagues, relationships are the ones that are healthiest and happiest. And that seems to be the process, as I've learned, in every situation. If you try to go it alone, all the difficulties are going to just knock you down. If you're willing to not make a change in your life, that old saying, in order to go up, you got to give up. You got to give up things. You got to give up old ways of thinking. You might have to give up old friends who won't change their thinking, and you have to consciously make decisions like, who am I dealing with? Who am I working with? Who am I connected with? Who are my influencers? And it's the same thing. I mean, I have some close friends who are, for example, in the AA program. They make a total change in terms of who they're relating to on a day-to-day basis, who they go to with groups, how they think. And so there's a lot of people, I don't think those tendencies and beliefs and those negatives ever go away. But the key is, there's a book called Soundtracks, for example. How do you reduce the negatives and replace them and add the positives? And the more positives and more influencers and the more books and the more podcasts and the more videos you listen to that keep reinforcing. I think that's the way the process, and that's the way that I talk to people. And that's the influence I try to offer, at saying, not only is there hope out there, because I know the strategy works, but there's a specific methodology. It comes around the parents first, making decisions about how they want to live their life and how they want to make changes. There's a number of books about mindset, right? And that we don't question our subconscious, but we just think that whatever has happened is just the way it is. But we can make those changes in our lives. We have to go deep down and saying, I'm going to change how I think. I'm going to change how I believe and feel and make, and those changes itself will then become natural process of life. So I didn't mean to get off on a big sermon, but that's we can all change. That's the beauty of it. And we're all going to have these negative things that happen to us, or challenging things. It's how we learn to deal with it.
What's been one, I love to ask everyone this question, is what's been one of the best things that's happened as a result of embarking on this journey or going into this space, even if it wasn't your choice?
Sure. Well, obviously, from my perspective, the best thing is seeing how my kids have grown and have changed, and and are able to manage and maintain. They're even talking about going to college now. That whole bit. I mean, that makes me very, very proud and excited to see their future. And I have a completely different mindset where 10 years ago, I'd be surprised if they even made it through high school. Now I'm happy to hear them talking about college. So on one end, that's a real positive. On the other end, just from a personal point of view, just the learning and sharing how I feel like this process, as I discussed before, that now no matter what comes up, I know there's a way around. There's a way to meet that challenge. There's a way to go out there and seek difference, and it's usually going to be through other people, other groups, other connections. And I guess if I had to pick one thing, I think I'd restate that word connection. The more positive connections that one has, that is in a growth-oriented process, the more resilient we're going to become, the more ready we're going to be able to change our sails and adjust to the many challenges that are out there. So I guess I would do that. I mean, I never thought in a million years I'd write a book. I mean, I wrote a book.
So that's what I was looking for, is like, what's one thing that happened that you never thought in a million years that you would do
Here's
as a
my little
result?
book. Yes, here's my little book. And
Where do we go from here?
Wrote it on trauma, and you know what? It ended up being number one on Amazon in 8 different categories. I said,
Awesome.
What? I'm not a writer. I'm not anything special. I just wrote from my experiences and what we were doing, and all of a sudden that happened. I put together a website, and now I put out little blurbs and blogs and encouragements and things like that. I never thought I would do any of that. I mean, if your audience is interested, it's called childtraumasherpa.com. And the book's still up on Amazon, and there's plenty of, I mean, I keep it as low as possible just to cover costs, because I'm not in this for the profit. I'm in this to spread the word. And
Yeah.
and I really love talking to people and who are going through this process and saying, hey, it happened to me, it can happen to you. If you're willing to, there's a way out of this.
Yeah. My wife's adopted, all of her siblings as well. So my in-laws, they were always foster parents and whatnot. And,
Awesome.
so for me, that was my interest in interviewing you, was also because I'm sure as we've come along, I'm 48 and my wife's younger than me, but interested more in how the childhood trauma manifests in adults, be it behavior, beliefs, and whatnot. But we're in a time frame now that's so much different, where we've learned so much more, but we've also started having the conversations about it. And that's kind of the biggest difference, I think, as opposed to, you know, like I have to wonder, did her parents have any of this knowledge when they started doing this way back when, whether it was the late
Yeah.
70s or early 80s, and
Yeah.
just how much it's come, or, you know, my in-laws, they're pretty well adjusted. So they did something right. Whether they knew it or it had a name or a technique or something, they did something right. But I do find it interesting, and I think the important thing is understanding that, some of the adult behaviors we see, whether it's with people, whether we work with them, whether we're in relationships with them, that some of the, whether it's, lashing out or something, can all be kind of to that. And I think it kind of goes back to that same thing of creating the connection and the safe space, um, with that person. Even as an adult, almost the solution's very similar.
And it's interesting you said that. One of the things that we were looking at and addressing now is the term called generational trauma. It's
Hmm.
passed on from one generation to the next, and nobody questions it. They just think it's the normal process
I'm trying to
until
stop that.
yes, until it gets stopped. And sometimes it can be one person who just wakes up and says, "Oh, I don't have to do it that way. I don't have to melt down or scream or yell, or I don't know why this is happening. Let's go find out. I can make changes in my life." And the fact that you can, I mean, sometimes the word trauma is overused
Hmm.
because everybody says, "Oh, you're such a pain. You're giving me trauma." but the beauty of it is now it's recognized as something real, and it's not just a made up term, but they actually have a neurological basis to it, and whenever there's a medical basis, that just turns the question on its side in terms of, okay, they can also be solved. How do we do it? What changes do we make? What do we, So I think that's positive, and those are some of the things that I want to try to do more and more of, especially around schools, because they're not used to adjusting their system to kids with special needs, right? They want everybody to
Yeah,
fit in a cookie cutter.
they just put those people, and they filter them out as opposed
Yeah,
to adjusting what they're doing.
well,
You know, the school doesn't have the problems. They're not culpable in any part of it.
right. Yeah.
So
And,
they
and
think.
and what if we were able to train teachers differently? What if they went through this process? What if we created different classrooms? And what if there's a lot of what
Yeah.
ifs and questions, and why aren't we evolving and changing and challenging? And some schools are, but we have so many school systems and so many districts and so many ways of thinking and so many limited budgets that people are limited in the way they think, and this is the way we've always done it.
Well,
So
it's kind of a shame because it kind of becomes this system thing and funding and for teaching for the test and blah blah blah. And what we seem to forget is, you know, most people who go into teaching, they don't go in for the money, they don't go in for this or that, they go in for the love of it.
Yeah.
for the love of whether it's the teaching, the kids, the whole process. So I don't think it would be asking a lot for them to learn something additional to make a better experience for both them and the student. So the problem is with the system and not necessarily the teachers.
Yes.
Because why wouldn't they want it to be better? That's their
Yep.
whole career is designed to do that.
Well said. And we just have to give them enough tools, enough opportunities to, and that's why I do a lot of interviews, just not me, but many people want to get the word out. So it becomes a thing. It becomes a process, and maybe we can change, a tipping point over time to where the schools begin to react to it. I mean, in fairness, the schools have done a great job, I'll say effective job, in terms of dealing with autism, right? Kids on the
Hmm.
spectrum, because but it took many, many years
Yeah.
for them to deal with it. So how do we half-life that for kids with trauma? Because the way you treat trauma is exactly opposite of how you treat people kids on the spectrum. So how do you make those changes? How do you get flexible? How do you identify them and set up a classroom for them and give teachers the right teaching? Because you're right, the teachers love to take care of the kids and relate to
Hmm.
them and want the best for them. But they need the tools.
Yeah,
And
man, that's gotta be so tough. Like, when I think about most public schools and what you had talked about, whether it's creating that connection in that safe space, that for somebody with trauma, a public school is the furthest thing probably from a safe space because just in general, all the kids moving about between classes, just the chaos, the amount of um and if you're lost, you don't know where to go, the campus is big, it's overwhelming. I could imagine, even if you had a teacher escort or something, that it's still the amount of volume and input and chaos is enough to stir anybody up.
yeah, and then you throw on the bus rides because there's no teachers on the buses, right? Then you talk about the lunch and the playgrounds, and there's very few interactions over there, and it's just one issue after another, after another, after another. And
That was kind of why I was asking how long ago the school started. Because Lakeside, because like I was saying, my daughter goes to an art school, and they develop much sooner in bigger parts of the country and more metropolitan areas. But where I'm from, in a small town, it's happened while I was in the process of growing up. And so it's kind of like that difference, that lag of whether it's 20, 30 years that you're getting some of the programs and some of the places that people can actually thrive. Um, so, and that was kind of my point behind asking that is, where can we cut that lag? And, whether it's having special schools for kids on the spectrum or kids with the trauma. So there's not all that volume, not all that chaos, and not all that information. Like you said, it's about understanding if it requires the safety, then what's the safe? Let's make safe environments because, it's just too much. I mean, your normal average kid going to high school who has to worry about, depending on where you live, can have to worry about everything from being bullied, beat up to weapons in the school. It's just bananas.
yeah,
It's
and a
it's
lot of those
crazy
kids,
almost how could a normal person even survive that or think it's safe?
and a lot of those kids don't even get a decent meal if they don't go to school, right? That might be their only meal of the day.
Yeah.
That's a form of trauma in itself, much less the safety and the environment and how loud it is, and that age group, you know, bouncing off the wall. So yeah, there's a lot of rethinking that needs to go on, and kind of what we're trying to do is, sometimes it's one school at a time, one
Yeah.
teacher at a time, and over time, you hope you can reduce the amount of time it took for other changes to make.
But
And
yeah, seeing what's possible, that's kind of that thing of, you know, I had no idea these like Lakeside never existed, but seeing what's possible just opens up opportunity and people hearing this. And if even if their town doesn't have something like this, whether it's advocating for it, raising money for it, sometimes you just got to do things yourself.
Yeah.
You got to be proactive. Um, if you want it to change, but and that sometimes is sparked by that little bit of hope, and that person who ran into you gave you that little bit of hope that was enough to research and move forward. And I hope this conversation does the same for some people out there, is give them that hope that, hey, there's schools out there like this. Maybe you just need to know where to look. Maybe you need to know that they're available, and creating those safe environments and whatnot. I've learned quite a bit. But where can people find you?
Well, thank you. Again, our site is what's called childtraumasherpa.com,
Hmm.
or we have a shortened version, ctsherpa.com. Also up on Facebook and Instagram. And then again, we're more than welcome to take a look at our book. On that website is a link to our book, Where Do We Go From Here? And we'd love to connect. And I have emails on there for us if anybody have questions, or posts on social media, and love to reach out and connect any way we can. We're here to support and help anybody who needs a little bit of hope.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, before we go, I give everyone the opportunity. If you want to ask me anything, you're welcome to. If not, that's fine as well.
Well, I'm fascinated what got you into podcasting. That I mean, you're very good at this, and you're very easy to talk to. And is it something you always wanted to do, or is it something that
No,
just
it
fell
was
into?
I got laid off from healthcare during the pandemic, and I fumbled around for a few years, and dealt with trauma that I had from working in healthcare and level one trauma for 6 years
Hmm.
that I just didn't deal with at the time. And at some point, I was looking for jobs, wasn't having any luck, didn't want to relocate. It just wasn't what was best for my family and I at the time. And, my dad and my daughter both were encouraging, like, well, why don't you start a podcast? And at some point, I'm like, well, what makes me an expert other than I listen to them? And once I found that they had Spotify for podcasters and the barrier to entry was so low, it's almost a year ago, I just gave it a shot. And, you know, it was something I've always enjoyed them. So it was kind of like it started off maybe as more like a journal, but then I started interviewing people with things that I was interested in. And then I joined Podmatch and have gotten so many great interviews. But I've kind of described it as, because I've kind of been figuring it out as I've been going. But, I've always wanted to help people. Most of my jobs have been service related, from being in the military, working in restaurants, working in hospitals. I've always served people. And, this is a way that, without going back into healthcare, this is a way that I can continue to serve people, whether it's through my stories and experience or through the stories of others and their experience. And it's about kind of documenting, keeping a little piece of history as well. I mean, like my grandmother passed away maybe a couple years ago, and I still have a voicemail from her. But this kind of technology, and it allows us to hold on to these time capsules, and to have a historical reference. But then there's also, like, when we're long gone, one day our children can go back and listen to this and know why we do what we did, to know what we were thinking, sometimes to know how we got into this. Sometimes our children don't know what our life was like before this, unless we told them, or unless they asked, or they forget we were they can see that we were a totally different person before we were the parents that they knew. And so, yeah, there's so many reasons. And I always say I can reach more people and these stories of others can help more people than I could ever help at the 2 clinics I used to manage. So that was kind of, I needed something to do at the time. I needed something to focus my attention on, and this was it. And I've kind of got the podcasting piece down, and now it's time to focus on the business part and continue this going. But as long as I love it and continue to have great guests, which I will. So that's what it's about. And kind of that's why I did it. And it, a couple weeks will be a year. And it's just something that I've kind of stuck with, that I really didn't know I would do it. I didn't have any clue. I think maybe I thought about it at one point, when I was in my professional career, like, oh, how cool would it be to be a podcaster? But then you're like, well, I'm a healthcare administrator, so this is what I do. But then at some point you have to pivot and kind of reinvent when you're left with no other options, a bit like yourself, and you're in this situation and you're like, well, you know, you find a little bit of hope, and you do some thinking and you do some praying, and you understand that, hey, these are your gifts, these are your qualities, this is your heart, and how can you use that? And then you start, like for me, starting to understand that all the interviews I conducted looking for a lead nurse was beneficial for me to interview people for a podcast, and what they taught me, and about the business portion of it. And you know because I can tell you, working with um, physicians and nurses is not the easiest job, and
Okay.
managing them is even more difficult. So, but yeah, I just kind of, and I've learned to become thankful of all the tools that it gave me, and starting to put
I
all
can
that together. So it's been a blessing. I never thought I would do it. I never thought I'd be doing it a year later, but I feel more fulfilled than I've ever felt, and I love it.
Sounds like you're on a great journey.
Yeah, I'm I'm trying. And I'm gonna
That's
just keep
awesome.
going, keep going, keep going. But yeah, it's definitely the conversations, the meeting of people, and um, because one of one of the main through lines of the podcast is you're not alone. You're not crazy. These things happen to other people. Um, and we can learn from one another, and we can build community, and there might be somebody out there who's gone through the same exact thing and who has solved the riddle, and you might just be one conversation away from it, one listen to a podcast away from it, you know one introduction away from that person, and this is
Fantastic.
kind of the way.
Well, I certainly appreciate being on with you. You're very easy to talk to, so it's
Well,
it's
thank you.
been wonderful. And thank you.
Awesome. Well, I will drop you an email with the release dates and all that as we get closer. But yeah, it's been great talking to you, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
man.
you. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
having me. Cheers. Bye.
Well, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Remember, go out and be the person that you want to meet.
Let go.
Asteroid of fear.